Welcome, family and friends. It's great to have you here. Make sure you're comfortable, maybe with your preferred beverage, and let's explore today's story. Tom waited in the car for his son to come out of the house. It was his weekend with the boy and, like most 5-year-olds, it took the kid forever to get ready. Once upon a time, Tom would have helped to dress him and find the socks that were tossed chaotically over the bedroom, plus the backpack that would have gotten hidden behind a chair or in the closet. But the house belonged to his ex-wife's new husband, so Tom waited outside. Tom's ex, Randy, was probably chasing after Liam as she tried at the same time to get herself ready to go out. That thought made Tom smile. She was always stressed under pressure. And when she was stressed, she lost her temper. "Be on time, please," Randy had commanded. "This dinner is important to Hank. He has clients coming in from Asia. This meeting is critical to his business." Tom had kept quiet during the telephone lecture. He did not, for example, say anything about how he was always on time, or how it was Randy, Hank, and Liam who were always late. He also said nothing about how he did not give a shit whether the dinner was important to Hank or not. Hank had, after all, talked Randy into his bed while Randy was still married to Tom. Tom did not say how Hank only wanted Randy to be his arm candy, because her rack looked nice in a low-cut dress when he had client dinners. Most importantly, Tom said nothing to Randy about how, if anyone had asked Tom what he wanted, the answer would have been just a couple of minutes to disembowel Hank with a rusty knife, and then garrot him with his own intestines. Tom had even looked online and found a pair of waterproof work gloves with no slip grip that would have kept the gory offal from escaping his grasp, as he really pulled the guts around the fuckhead's throat. He said none of that though, and just kept quiet as he listened to the squawking on the other end of the phone. He had something better in his pocket, awaiting deployment. Neither Tom nor Randy had come from money. Neither one had lived in poverty either, but Randy dreamed of being rich. Tom, on the other hand, was happy with a comfortable wage and decent house. They had met at a work networking function, dated for a while, and gotten married. When they had met, Randy was in one of her dieting phases. She had bad eating habits and, when stressed, she ate to excess. Then, after loading on the pounds, she dieted with every miracle cure drug she could find and exercised like a maniac, sacrificing sleep to do so. She'd be thin for a while, but then would balloon up again. Her family tended to be fat, which was an extra problem because they all had severe hypertension. Randy went through the weight loss weight gain cycle 3 times while she and Tom were together. Hank seduced her when she was in one of her thin phases, and she seemed to have kept the weight off for the past 1.5 years. Tom realized that the weight loss should have been his clue to the affair. He missed it though. He only learned about it when Randy told him she was trading up. Tom did everything he could to put the brakes on the divorce. He was not trying to preserve the marriage. He was trying to be a dick. It was the only weapon he had. He had a good attorney though, a guy who was a friend of a friend. He fought everything. He even demanded counseling. That offended Tom. He didn't want to talk to her. But the lawyer calmed him down, explaining that Randy wanted to talk to him even less than he wanted to talk to her, and that they could always withdraw the request. After all, Randy wanted to get married to Hank, so she had an incentive for things to move fast. Tom's lawyer filed motions challenging everything, got hearings scheduled, then rescheduled, and then filed other motions. When it came time to argue the motion for counseling, Tom's attorney withdrew the motion in court, as promised, after Randy and Hank had gone through all the time and expense of preparing. Finally, after months of arguing over everything, Randy gave Tom a check to go away, and signed all common property over to him. She even paid for Tom's lawyer. Since she had no money of her own, it was obviously coming from Hank. Tom called it a win. The divorce had just been finalized a month before. Randy and Hank had gotten married shortly afterwards. Tom had kept Liam while the happy couple went on their honeymoon. Now, it was time. The final piece of payback. And this one did not involve anyone's intestines. The door opened and Liam came bounding down the steps and ran along the walkway. He did not understand why he had to live in 2 houses, but it adapted. Tom got him belted into his car seat and gave him a tablet with a movie on it. He walked up to the house. He knocked on the door. After a moment, Randy opened it, looking unhappy. "What?" She was trying to put on her earrings, make sure her hair was perfect, send out a text message to her new husband about her status, and get out the door in her little black dress and stiletto-heeled shoes, all at once. "Had to share a story with you," Tom announced with a smile. Randy had always complained that his stories were long and boring. She was about to say something like that now, but Tom held up his hand. "It's about the lottery." That stopped her. Despite herself, she was interested. Randy's fantasy was to win the lottery, especially the Giganto Bowl. The prize amount had recently been over $2 billion, one of the largest ever, and a winning ticket had been sold in their neighborhood. The story had been all over the news. But no one had come forward to claim the prize. An intrepid reporter had even pored over security video footage from the store that sold the ticket, but it was not possible to tell who bought it. Now, unfortunately, it was past the time to claim the prize, so the money just rolled back into the prize fund. Some guy won $2.2 billion a few weeks later. Randy was waiting for Tom to tell the story, but instead of speaking, he held up the ticket. Randy squinted to look at it. She was too vain to admit that she needed glasses. "It's the winning ticket," Tom said. "For the $2 billion drawing they were talking about back when we split up." He handed it to her. Surprise hit Randy's face. Or, it was. Now it's expired. Randy then looked shocked and desperately worked her thumbs over her phone, apparently looking up the number on the lottery site. She looked back and forth between her phone and the ticket, and finally up into Tom's face. Her expression went from shock to anger to fear, and then to misery before starting the cycle again. Tom pulled the ticket back. The blood vessels in her temples throbbed visibly. "See, I bought it just before you hit me with the divorce papers, which was actually the day before they announced the winner. It would have been part of the divorce settlement. Sure, my part would have been several $100 million after they deducted for paying a lump sum, and then took out taxes, and this is the important part, so would your part. And there was no fucking way that I was going to let that happen. That's right. I walked away from a lot of money and did it for spite so you would get nothing. That's how much I hate you. You and Hank have a nice night now." Randy had not said a word, but her jaw was working up and down, her neck muscles were tight, and she grabbed the door jamb. Tom turned and walked back to the car. He half expected Randy to follow him screaming, but nothing happened. He and Liam drove away. Randy's father called Tom on Sunday afternoon when he would normally be getting Liam ready to go back home. One of the unwritten conditions of the divorce was that Hank would under no circumstances ever communicate with or get close to Tom. The call was to tell Tom that Randy had suffered a severe stroke on Friday night as she was getting ready to go out. Hank had only discovered her condition when he returned from the dinner that Randy failed to attend. By the time she got medical help, she was in bad shape, paralyzed on one side, blind, and unable to speak. Randy's father asked Tom to keep Liam for the time being, until she got the therapy she needed and got back to normal, whenever that might be. Hank was going to have to spend considerable time taking care of Randy now. Tom agreed to keep Liam for the time being, and, on Monday, would ask his lawyer to file papers to make the temporary custody official for the time being. Hank would not oppose it, Randy could not. That night, before he went to sleep with a huge grin, Tom took one last look at the lottery ticket, and marveled how a world of possibilities opens up when you have a great Photoshop app, and a reputation for honesty. Georgia Plummer walked into the lobby of the 4-story building, across the marble tile floors, past the polished limestone walls, and to the stainless steel doors to the elevators. She didn't bother to stop at the information desk. She had instructions that told her that the office of Smith, Brown and Wilmot, Attorneys at Law, LLP, was on the 4th floor. The security guard at the information desk, hearing the click-click-click of her heels as she walked across the lobby, smiled at her, although as she passed she didn't reciprocate. That didn't really bother him, he just appreciated the fine figure she cut anyway. She was a dirty blonde with light brown eyes. He estimated her height as about 5'4", with shapely legs showing beneath the bottom of her skirt, enhanced by the heels of her shoes. The heels also lifted her derriere, tightening it, which, along with the underlying pantyhose, gave her one of those almost perfectly heart-shaped asses. Damn, he liked a tight ass. She was well endowed in the breast department as well, but the guard was cognizant that women have long known magnificent and deceitful ways for adjusting their apparent breast size to their needs of the moment. He thought that she was between a 34 and 36, residing in perhaps a C-cup. Her age, he guessed, was mid-30s. She was, in fact, 42 years old. It took all of 30 seconds, from the time that she entered the foyer until she disappeared into the elevator. When the elevator had delivered her to her destination, she exited and found herself facing the SB&W lobby. SB&W rented the entire floor, so there was no way to be lost. Georgia could only go one place, straight forward. She passed through the glass doors with the SB&W logo embossed on it, treading on a sumptuous gray carpet, plush by commercial standards. She walked up to the reception desk. The light blue-colored walls were no doubt intended to warm the atmosphere. "May I help you?" asked the young woman sitting behind the desk, looking up at Georgia through her fashionably small ovoid-shaped glasses. "Please. I am looking for," Georgia looked at the piece of paper in her hand, "Anne Wilmot. I have an appointment." The receptionist flashed her professional smile at Georgia, who might, after all, be an important client, and then picked up her phone, dialing a few numbers and quietly speaking into the mouthpiece. Ms. Wilmot will be here in just a minute. May I get you some coffee, or tea? Or perhaps, you might prefer some water. We have bottles. The receptionist giggled. They even have our name and logo on them, as she pointed to a half-empty bottle on her desk. Actually, Georgia replied, a water would be great, as she sat down in one of the plush burgundy overstuffed chairs in the waiting area. The young woman handed her a bottle. We're informal here, but if you want a glass, she questioned. Georgia just shook her head, twisted off the top and took a sip. The question came from the side. It was a warm voice, soft and smooth, pitched a little on the low side for a woman. Mrs. Plummer. Georgia turned her head, searching for the source of this seductive feminine voice, to see a woman walking towards her from the side hall into the waiting area. I'm Anne Wilmot, Mrs. Plummer, she said, as she came up, her right hand extended out. Georgia stood, automatically took her hand, and found it to be a warm and firm, but completely dry grip, as they shook hands in that understated way that women introduced for the first time do. In that single moment, Georgia took in Anne Wilmot in a single glance. People's opinion was split when they first met Anne Wilmot. Was her most striking feature the long and wavy Titian red hair, or the green eyes against her pale, but perfect complexion? Encountering her the first time tended to result in a slightly extended pause, while they took in a first impression. That was followed by the realization that even without her high heels on, Anne Wilmot would have been at least 5'7", and that underneath the professional grey woolen skirt and jacket set was a lean, well-contoured body. Her breasts weren't as large as Georgia's, but they weren't small either, and she still looked like the swimmer that she had been through her university years, the upper body strength transparent through her coat. An aquiline nose, with high cheekbones, over a surprisingly full and sensual mouth, with lips that needed no enhancement. The second impression of Anne Wilmot was of a passionate woman. Georgia hated Anne Wilmot on sight, and her lips, thin and at that moment rather bloodless, tightened. I want to immediately came from Georgia's mouth. Please, Anne smiled as she interrupted Georgia's immediate outburst. Come into my office and we can talk there. Georgia followed in Anne's footsteps, her demands placed on hold. Georgia found herself sitting in a red leather upholstered chair, across the desk from Anne Wilmot. The lawyer had asked if she could allow her a minute while she spoke with her secretary, giving instructions not to be disturbed, as well as a few other directions. Anne left the room. Georgia heard her with half an ear, while looking at the degrees and pictures hanging on the wall. If Georgia's math was correct, hardly ever a certain thing, Anne Wilmot would be about 36 years old, based on the undergraduate degree in his frame. Her law degree was dated several years after her undergraduate diploma, but Georgia really had no idea what the combination of Columbia and Michigan law implied. Georgia had attended the state university for a couple of years, but found it unedifying, when not plainly confusing. The best she could say for it was, she met her husband there. Georgia speculated about the photographs. One of an older couple, probably parents, given the man's red hair, and the woman's facial resemblance to Anne Wilmot. Graduation photos. Photos in front of the building with several older men in suits, presumably other lawyers in the firm. Finally, there were a number of pictures of a young boy, about 10 or 12 years old. A recent school photo, a portrait of the boy with Anne Wilmot, and a photo of the boy playing soccer, taken at the moment his foot connected with the ball. The most interesting to Georgia was the lack of any pictures of Anne Wilmot with a man who looked like a lover or husband. Anne re-entered the room. Pardon me, but now we should be able to talk without a constant stream of interruptions. Anne smiled as she sat down across the desk from Georgia. By the way, thank you for coming in. I know it was on short notice. I don't understand what is going on, Georgia stated, quite firmly, even petulantly. I don't understand why I am here talking to you, and I want to know where my husband is. Where is Dawn? Do you know where Dawn is? That is what your email implied. Her eyes glared across the desk. Anne didn't seem to notice Georgia's attitude, and instead shuffled around some papers on her desk, as if she were looking for one paper in particular. Then she found it, looked at it and seemed somehow satisfied. I know in general terms, Mrs. Plummer, but no, I don't know specifically where he is at the moment. I do know how to contact him, Anne concluded, looking the entire time into Georgia's eyes. Then contact him, came Georgia's peremptory command, as she suddenly sat more upright in her chair, in an attempt to display her displeasure. It's not quite so simple, Anne explained. I need to ask you a few questions first. Your husband suggested that I should try and clarify what has been occurring in your relationship, before he establishes contact. Anne's voice had remained calm and even soothing the entire time that she spoke, but somehow to Georgia, there was something not right. She didn't bother to respond. Good. Now, as I understand it, Mrs. Plummer, you moved out of the house that you shared with Donald for the past 10 years, along with your younger daughter. Anne glanced down at the page in her hand. About a year ago. Your older daughter, she looked again, as if to refresh her memory. Samantha, who would have been a sophomore in college, was living on campus, and consequently didn't accompany you. Is that all correct? Yes. Donald and I had been having some marital disagreements, and I thought that a period of separation would be good for both of us to cool off and clear our heads. Georgia smiled as she responded. So I moved into an apartment not far from where my parents live, about 50 miles from here, in Greensville. Anne nodded as if in agreement, although it was just acknowledging that she understood what Georgia had said. She went on to her next question. And, as I understand it, this was not a legal separation. Don paid for your apartment, continued to pay for your car and insurance. You and your daughter remained on his medical insurance, and he also paid you an amount of money for Elle's expenses. Anne looked very serious as she asked these questions. After all, not every husband would be so scrupulous looking after a wife's well-being, who wasn't living with him. That's all true, but I continue to work as well. I'm employed by an insurance company, and I was able to transfer to our Greensville office, Georgia admitted, and it wasn't like Don couldn't afford it. You know, he owns his business, and makes oodles of money. Georgia unconsciously glanced down at the designer dress, the Gucci handbag, and Prado shoes she was wearing, evidence of both Donald's ability to make money, as well as his largesse towards his wife, and her rather expensive habits of dress. Anne looked at Georgia with the appraising eye of a woman who knows just how much the outfit and accessories would cost. Not that Anne's apparel had carried a lesser price tag, but she had earned every penny of it herself. I'll take your word for it, Anne replied, after a short hesitation, and, correct me if I'm wrong, but you moved back here and into your home with Donald some 4 months ago. Yes. After some discussion, I decided that we'd been apart long enough, and we came to an agreement with respect to our marriage with which I felt comfortable. Georgia answered the question easily enough, but to someone with Anne's training, her body language was crying out that she was concealing something, as Georgia crossed her arms and retreated back as deeply as she could into her seat. Anne continued. During the roughly 8 months, she caught Georgia's eyes to confirm the time period that you were living in Greensville. Donald saw Elle. Her eyes sought the paper again, 3 times. At this, Georgia was visibly fidgeting in the chair, uncomfortable about where the discussion was leading. Not surprisingly, her voice took on a defensive tone when she answered. It was very difficult to arrange things. Donald is always so busy, and my schedule and his often conflict. And Elle had become a very active girls' school, sports, and boys. Of course, George's chin raised slightly, in that go ahead, give it your best shot pose, so I suppose that he didn't see Elle as much as he would have liked. But that's hardly my fault. The tone in Georgia's voice was provocative, and she was visibly irritated. Anne let Georgia have a moment to collect herself, just allowing a brief quiet pause. Let's move on, then, Anne said to Georgia's great relief. You started calling around trying to find Donald 3 days ago. The question Anne asked seemed so innocuous that Georgia answered without really thinking. Yes. Donald had driven our daughters back to school. They're both attending the same university now, and the drive takes about a day each way. They had one of those rental trailers that Don was towing with his SUV. The girls will be living together in an apartment at school this year, so Don was going to help them move in and stay for a couple days to make sure that everything was working out for them, in case there were any problems that he could fix before he came back. Then, he was supposed to return. But he didn't. Return, that is. She took a deep breath after the explanation. Anne looked at Georgia with a somewhat skeptical look on her face. Wasn't he supposed to be back over a week ago? She queried. I guess, came Georgia's noncommittal reply. You didn't notice that he was at least 4 days overdue? This time Anne asked with complete incredulity, her eyebrows raised in disbelief. You didn't notice that his side of the bed was empty at nights? At this Anne actually chuckled, while shaking her head. Georgia pounced on that. We have separate rooms, and busy schedules. Not that it's any of your business. Georgia almost hissed at this irksome woman. This time she pressed on. I think it's time that you tell me where I can find my husband. Georgia spat out, her eyes growing narrow, leaning forward in an aggressive stance. But Anne didn't give any appearance of having heard her. She was holding a photograph that she had taken off the wall. A red-haired boy with incredible joy on his face, kicking a soccer ball. Parker, she said, as if that was an explanation. My son Parker. He's 12 now. I've been divorced from his father since he was 2 years old. Anne's words came from her mouth, but her eyes were staring into space, back in time. His father, Ted, was an alcoholic. A brilliant man in many ways, but a horrible man when he was drunk. She paused and took a breath. The couple of times that he hit me, I took it. I made excuses for it. It was really my fault, I would say. I tried to get him to change, tried to get him to stop. Suddenly her eyes were very focused on Georgia, almost making her shiver. But the night that drunken bastard accidentally broke my baby's arm, my 2-year-old baby's arm, was when I realized that you can't change someone, make them better, force them to behave the way they should. There comes that time when you have to bite the bullet and cut the ties. I filed for divorce the next day, and since that time, I've never seen him again. After we've been divorced for about 6 months, I never heard from him again, either, she concluded. But Georgia asked, a little afraid of this woman after her outburst, what does that have to do with my husband? Your husband, Donald, is Parker's soccer coach, came the simple calm reply. I'll bet you don't even know that he was giving his time a couple of days a week coaching a team, did you? Georgia just shook her head without saying anything. In fact, you don't know very much about your husband, because for all intents and purposes, you left him and your marriage over a year ago, didn't you? Anne's voice was becoming harsher now, and it was she leaning forward over her desk, the aggression visible in her lovely green eyes. Georgia seemed to almost shrink and wilt in the face of this verbal assault, saying nothing, shaking her head. In fact, the story that you've told me today is a sanitized, self-serving version, a fairy tale, that you've concocted to portray yourself as a virtuous wife, when in fact you have been having an affair for over a year. Anne pressed her hard. You didn't move out because you and Donald had marital disagreements, did you? Does the name Brian Cushing mean anything to you? Anne demanded. He works for the same insurance company that I do, was George's almost whispered reply. Isn't the truth that you moved to Greensville so that you could continue to see your lover, Brian Cushing, who had been promoted to a management position at the Greensville office? Anne continued to hammer at Georgia. No, Georgia stammered, without conviction, tears filling her eyes. Without a let-up, Anne continued, and while you were living in that apartment in Greensville, wasn't it convenient that you could send your daughter to your parents, sometimes for days at a time, so that you could entertain Brian Cushing in an apartment for which your husband was paying? Georgia was whimpering slightly, and shaking her head, but not answering. And all the while, Donald was calling you each week trying to set up times when he could come and see his daughter. But you would disappear with her shopping, going to a movie, anything to keep him from seeing her. Worse, telling her that her father didn't care about her, that he didn't want to be bothered with her. Anne's face filled with contempt as she spoke. But she didn't tell you about the cell phone that he gave her after the second time he saw her, did she? You never knew that she was actually able to speak with her father when she wanted, did you? Did you wonder why neither of your girls said goodbye to you when they left for college this year? Or did you even notice? It was a pounding indictment that Anne was laying on Georgia. Then, 4 months ago, you suddenly decide to return with Elle. Did you think no one would understand the connection between your lover being moved back here by your company and your sudden urge to return from Greensville? Anne was almost laughing as she spoke. The best part, your demand to Donald that you would return, but only on the condition that you would have an open marriage, meaning you would continue to see your lover. Because you know Donald too well, and know that he wouldn't cheat on you, despite your behavior, as long as you were married. Georgia, though, was ready to fight back. You can't prove any of that, she exclaimed, but her protestations didn't matter to Anne. She just continued. I don't suppose that you have even noticed that you haven't had what we in the legal profession call conjugal relations with Donald for over a year, have you? Did you ever notice that Donald stopped asking for or expecting sex from you from the time that you started your affair with Brian Cushing? That it was within days of when you initiated your sordid little liaison that Donald moved out of your bed and into the guest room? Did he put a lock on the door to keep you out? Or were you just too self-centered to notice? Georgia had tears streaming down her face when she started to argue back. It is true that I haven't been paying attention to Donald like I should, but that's about to change. He's going to have more sex than he has ever. She stopped in the middle of her sentence, as a sudden epiphany shattered her complacency. She stared hard at the woman across the table from her, younger, beautiful, no stunningly gorgeous woman sitting there, her face flushed with emotion and passion. She wasn't some neutral party, she was a player in the game, fighting to win Donald for herself. You're in love with Donald, aren't you? The question reflecting the horror in her eyes. You're having an affair with my husband. Suddenly Georgia started to assert a new confidence. You won't get away with this. Donald is my husband, and he's going to remain my husband. Her face visibly hardened, her eyes became slits, her lips two horizontal lines. At that instant, Anne slid a document, stapled together, across the table, the print facing Georgia, in order that she could read the large petition for the dissolution of marriage, written at the top of the front page. "I don't think so. You have been served," came Anne's quiet reply. "Don is biting the bullet, cutting the ties, just like I did 10 years ago." She sat back in her chair. There was a pause. "I met Don shortly after you had moved out. He was coaching my son Parker's soccer team. He seemed like such a great guy, but there was also this deep sadness about him when he wasn't working with the boys. He just loves coaching those kids," Anne explained, looking into space again. "One Saturday, after a game, the whole team went out for pizza afterwards, and eventually Don and I were the only adults left, and we started talking. I told him my horror story about my divorce, and he told me about you and your affair. He couldn't help it, he cried. I think that I may have first fallen for him right then, a man who could love so deeply, be so hurt, and still struggle on each day. Even finding a place in his heart to be there for other people's children." Her face had a sudden pensive look. But then, Anne returned to the matter at hand. Her hand reached to the papers, and pointed out the stated cause. "Irreconcilable differences." "Donald," she said, "is citing irreconcilable differences, rather than adultery, as the cause. He is offering you a very generous settlement, more than I would have recommended, given the circumstances. Obviously, child custody isn't an issue, since both of your daughters are now legal adults. That's why Donald waited until now to file. He won't get off this easy," declared a now outraged Georgia. "He can't prove a thing, and I'll counter-sue based on your affair. If he wants this divorce, I'll take him to the cleaners. And as for you, I suspect that your relationship with Donald will raise some eyebrows when you try to explain how you can represent someone with whom you are having an ongoing love affair." Georgia had a triumphant look in her eyes, as she struck back at this arrogant woman. Hearing that, Anne laughed. "I'm not Donald's attorney. My practice is entirely corporate law. Donald just asked me if I would care to be the one who served you with your divorce papers," was her reply, the glint in her eyes mocking the soon-to-be ex-wife across the desk. "When you get back home, you'll find the door to Donald's room will be unlocked, and it will be empty of his personal effects," the look of triumph now on Anne's face. "And just for your information, yes, I love Donald deeply, but we've never had sex together. Not because of me I've been willing, no, more I've wanted him for some time, but because Donald is too honorable and honest to betray his vows, regardless of how you've treated him. He refuses to make love to me until you're at least legally separated," she stated as she sat back in her chair, looking exhausted from her efforts. "You just tell Donald, it isn't going to be that easy," was George's reply through clenched teeth. Anne once again displayed that beguiling and enigmatic smile, as she reached into a drawer and began gently tossing photographs across her desk for George's edification. There were pictures of Georgia and Brian Cushing locked together in various sexual positions and acts. Georgia was horrified and shocked they were from inside the apartment in Greensville. "No court will allow these," she sneered. "This is a massive invasion of privacy. I may have all of you arrested." She had moved forward in her chair again, her elbows on Anne's desk, looking like she would enjoy nothing more than reaching across and choking the life from her rival. "Ah," Anne answered softly. "Did you think that Don would pay for your apartment, your little private love nest for you and your lover, out of the goodness of his heart? Have you always thought that he was stupid?" Anne was truly curious about that, because to her mind, trained in legal logic, there wasn't really another answer. That was Don's apartment. He paid for it, remember? That was his name on the lease. He had a key. He had every right to have monitoring equipment installed. "No, you're wrong. These pictures are entirely legal, and if you try to fight the divorce, they will be used in the proceedings." Anne wasn't even gloating anymore, as she explained the reality of the situation to Georgia. Georgia had sat back in the chair and was clearly focused inward, not seeing through her open eyes, when Anne spoke again. "I do have a question for you. There are an awful lot of photos and hours of videos of you and Brian. Was it all as boring as it looked? Did you really give up Donald and your marriage for that?" Anne just shook her head. She found it incomprehensible. Georgia was locked in her own thoughts, and didn't even hear Anne's last question. She was at a loss regarding what she should do now. Brian had dumped her the week before, claiming his wife had put her foot down. So much for his promises that he would leave his wife. At some level, Georgia knew that the real reason for his callous and cavalier attitude was that he had seduced one of the younger women at the office. She even thought that she knew who, the bitch who was dressing up a bit these days, and who seemed to look at her with contempt as she passed. What Georgia didn't know about were the photos that Brian's wife had received from an anonymous source. Don wouldn't have approved sending the photos, but Anne thought that it added a certain symmetry to the situation. In truth, Georgia had never considered that she wouldn't be able to return to Donald and restore her marriage. But that vanity had just been swept from her imagination. What would she do now? The voice in her head had no answer. Slowly Georgia lifted herself from the chair and began to walk towards the door. Anne silently rose as well, and retrieving the documents from her desk, handed them to Georgia before she left. "Oh, by the way," Anne stopped to say, "Donald is at one of the soccer fields around town with the team. The boys are playing for the championship of their division today. But I still don't think he wants to talk to you." Dazed, Georgia didn't remember leaving the building, but the security guard was shocked. He could hardly believe that the woman who could barely walk out of the building was the same fox who had entered less than an hour earlier. She appeared to have shrunk, to have collapsed inside herself. Where there had been drive, there was now despair. The confidence was now humbled. She was a different woman, and her expensive clothes, her tastefully applied makeup, nothing could hide the change. XXX. Driving home in her black Mercedes was one of Anne's pleasures in life. It fit in with the expectation of what a high-powered attorney should drive, but more important to her was the feeling of control that she had as she would speed down the road. That need to feel in control was one of the gifts from her ex-husband, that and the 2 dental implants where he knocked out 2 teeth. They looked completely natural, the color matched her other teeth perfectly, which they damn well should add almost $2,000 apiece. Way better than a bridge. But today, her mind was on other things as she returned to her home. Another result of her disastrous marriage was that she didn't trust men. For 10 years, well, 9 years, anyway, Anne had been completely uninterested, despite the many men who made it clear that they would be available, if she were in the game. That was until she met Donald Plummer. She had indeed met Donald when he was coaching her son's soccer team. He was a little older than she would have normally considered eligible, at least for her. At 43, he was 7 years older than she. He was handsome, and still physically fit, and one of the things that Anne noticed while watching her son's practices and games was that there was never a woman waiting for him when he finished coaching. Never. Not even when the teams would go out for lunch or dinner after games, when most of the coaches' wives would show up at least part of the time. He wore a simple wedding band, but that might be camouflage. It was also an anomaly that he didn't himself have a son playing. With other men, the combination of no wife around and no son playing might have raised other questions. But, as soon as she inquired of some of the other soccer moms, she heard the short version of his story. Married, but with wife living in Greensville. The separation, job-related, at least it was the story. What impressed her most about Don was his character. He was kind and generous to the boys, even those whose skills were not completely up to par with their contemporaries. He was unfailingly polite to everyone, even the refs. And to Anne's complete surprise and admiration, he never hit on her, something that she was accustomed to from almost every man, 15-year-old Romeos to 75-year-old Lotharios. He treated her in a friendly manner, as an intelligent person, but without the pressure of any sexual innuendo or expectations. That was before their mutual confessions after the pizza dinner. As she trembled recounting her tale of woe from her first marriage, Don covered her hand with his, gently patting it, just a simple gesture of comfort. When Anne got Don to reveal his more recent wounds, he began to quietly weep, trying to resist, but unable to hold back. Anne moved to his side of the table, and put her arms around him and held him, until his grief had passed. It was her fault, if fault it was. That night as they returned to their cars, she pulled him to her, and they kissed. Nothing between them had been the same since. It still hadn't been easy for her to trust, even Don. With the resources at her disposal due to her law practice, she had a background check done on him, just to be sure that he was telling her the truth, and that he wasn't some sort of parasite wanting to be supported by a high-earning wife. To her great surprise, the report revealed that she didn't even come close to having his earnings or assets. He had a well-managed and profitable business, so money didn't seem to be his motivation. And other than his deteriorating marriage, there didn't appear to be any other skeletons in his closets. He was the real thing. She activated the garage door opener, the door rose and she pulled into her house. She gathered her purse and briefcase and entered into the kitchen. She dropped off her purse and keys on the end of the counter, in a corner where they would be convenient to retrieve in the morning as she left. She put her cell phone on the recharger at the same time. "I'm home," she called out. "Hey, honey, I'm in the living room," came Don's voice. "Give me just a minute," Anne called back, as she entered into the master bedroom, and took her jacket off and hung it up. She returned to the living room where she found Don behind the bar. He walked out, and they embraced in a passionate kiss. Just like the very first time in the parking lot, Anne melted in Don's arms. She felt warm, protected, loved all of the things that she wanted, but hadn't gotten from her ex-husband. When they finally loosened their embrace of each other, Don reached over to the bar and handed Anne the strawberry daiquiri that he'd been preparing for her when she entered. He grabbed his JD rocks as soon as his hand was free. He looked at her, his vision of loveliness, his Aphrodite. His face lit up and the worry lines relaxed. You are now officially separated from your wife, and your divorce is in process. Anne told him, raising her glass and touching his in an ironic toast. At last. She sighed. Don wasn't overjoyed at the news. He wasn't by nature a vindictive sort of man. Although he was reconciled to the notion that divorce from his wife was the best course, he still wondered how he had failed as a man in his marriage. He took a drink and asked, "How does she take it?" Anne thought before she answered. As well as could be expected. I think that she somehow thought that she would just crook her finger at you, and you would come running. You would forget about the past year, forget about how she treated you. The girls? She asked. I called them a couple of hours ago. They weren't terribly surprised, came his reply. Don stepped forward and hugged Anne again, but at least this time he was smiling. Well, it's time for us to get on with our lives. What did you plan for tonight? He gently inquired, while hugging his Anne. Parker is staying over at Jen's place with his buddy Mark tonight. The house is ours. She giggled a little. We have dinner reservations at 7 p.m. at the Scoffier, she allowed, followed by, and at this point, Anne's hand ran across the front of Don's pants, stroking his rather evident erection. A quiet evening at home, just the two of us, making up for lost time. Don groaned slightly. Good Lord, Anne, be careful down there with your hand. It's been more than a year since my friend last visited a woman. I'm afraid that I'm going to disappoint you, because I'm not sure how long that can last. Anne looked at Don with a loving look in her eyes, and reached up, put her arms around his neck, and kissed him again. Baby, it's been 10 years for me since the last time anything masculine has taken care of me between my legs, so you've got your work cut out for you, was Anne's response. You gynecologist? He teased. She's a woman, mister. Now that you are officially free and I'm finally getting my shot at you, let me put it this way, I doubt you're going to be walking in the morning. She claimed, with that look of lust in her eyes. Don't worry about getting off too quickly the first time. I'll keep you hard all night. Good thing I'm the boss then. I'll declare tomorrow a personal holiday, was Don's wistful reply. They kissed again, before leaving for dinner. And that's a wrap for today's story. Trust is a fragile thing, and these stories remind us of the importance of nurturing it. Make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, so you never miss a shocking revelation. I can't remember when I first had my suspicions. My wife, Freya, and I had been married for about 5 years. We met just after we had finished university. We were both at her friend's birthday party, and her friend's boyfriend was a good friend of mine. I'm pretty sure I was invited so they could match us both up, as I was introduced to Freya almost as soon as I arrived, and before I knew it, we were alone. I knew nobody at the party, but Freya and I hit it off immediately and talked most of the night. What got me was her smile and the way her eyes sparkled when she did. The warmth and friendliness of it was intoxicating, and I never got tired of seeing it. As we dated, I began to notice that her eyes only sparkled for me. We exchanged numbers and arranged to meet for coffee the next day, which turned into the whole day. A year later we moved in together, and 2 years after that we were married. I think her behavior began to change when she got a new job about 2 years after we got married. She was unhappy in her job and she felt her career wasn't progressing. I, of course, encouraged her. I could see her eyes sparkled less and her job was getting her down. How was your first day? I asked her when she got home when she had started her new job. The sparkle returned to her eyes when she smiled. She didn't answer. She just took me upstairs and we made love. After she settled into her new job, Freya became very career-driven. She got a couple of promotions in quick successions, and soon she was earning more than me. When I mentioned that my supervisor was leaving, Freya asked me if I was going to go for it. Come on, Charlie. You could easily lead your team, she encouraged me. My lack of enthusiasm annoyed her. The problem was, while Freya had become career-driven, I was very much a work-to-life kind of guy, and any leadership role held no interest for me, and I had an intense dislike of office politics. Don't get me wrong, I earned very good money, plenty to fund my lifestyle, and have some left over. I was content to stay in my system administration role, especially as I was always able to earn enough to travel. We went away several times a year, exploring different countries. I loved adventures and I loved having them with Freya. Freya loved them too and loved having them with me as well, or so I thought. Things started to get awkward when Freya started to have calls from work and attended conference calls while we were away. Then she took her work laptop on our trips and insisted that we stayed in a hotel with Wi-Fi. I need to take this call, she would say. This is a very important meeting, where you go on ahead, I need to get this done. We can meet for lunch. We began to argue about her work. I was happy she was enjoying her job, but it was eating into our time together, and worst of all, when she looked at me, her eyes stopped sparkling. At this stage, I didn't think she was having an affair, at least if she was, it was with her work. With her latest promotion, she often had to work late, conference calls with the American office, and business trips away. I know what you are thinking, but her job did require her to do these things. My biggest worry was if she was going to be offered a job in New York. I knew she would take it, and that would have spelled the end of our marriage. Yes, we were drifting apart, but I still loved her, despite her long hours at work, business trips, and having little time for me. I said I wasn't sure when I had my first suspicions, but as I speak, now I do. My company got taken over and I knew I was going to be made redundant. I didn't mind so much despite the financial uncertainty. Freya was earning enough for the both of us to live on, and I was going to get a pretty good redundancy package, so I could still contribute at home while I looked for a new job. It just meant my traveling would have to stop for a while after I lose my job. However, because of my length of service, I was asked to help transfer all the servers to the new company. This meant I needed to be away from home for the odd week. About this time, Freya began talking about a colleague who had been seconded to her office from her New York office. She couldn't stop singing his praises as she excitedly talked about how funny he was, how popular with the ladies, and all the cliches that came with it. He is so ambitious, she told me, driving the dagger into me. Yes, you know where this is going, but this story is about how Freya's life crumbled by cheating on me, not how she cheated. You only need to know this for context. Well, when I returned from my trips away, she would insist that I call before I left for home, and when I got home the bed sheets were always in the washing machine. I know, the red flags were building up, but although I was getting worried, there wasn't enough for me to suspect an affair just yet. However, our intimacy, which had dwindled now, became non-existent. Freya would only give me the briefest of kisses. While she used to talk about this American colleague all the time, she now stopped. She jealously guarded her phone and wanted to know when I was next going to be away. I was now positive she was cheating on me. Two things now. Never cheat on someone who works in tech, and cheaters, when they think they are getting away with it, get lazy. I love traveling and I love tech. I never wanted promotions because it would have taken me away from technical work, and I am a hoarder of tech. I often bought old tech from my company. Webcams, modems, memory sticks. I had boxes full of it. So, it was no big deal for me to create a bit of spyware. Wireless webcams dotted around my house in the lounge, front door, and bedroom. All connected to an old laptop which I converted into a web server. Some freeware downloaded from the internet, and I had my own spy recording system. That's what I called it, and it helped me set up my own business later, but truth be told, it was really a homemade CCTV system, but it was still freakingly awesome. Being away from home meant I could set all this up, and Freya working late meant I could install it. I was actually quite proud of what I did. It had sound and everything. Once everything was in place, I caught her in the act. I'll be honest with you, I thought the batteries in the webcams would run out before I got the evidence, but Freya must have been desperate for sex because they were at it as soon as he walked through the door. Now, I had the evidence, but getting hold of it and seeing it was proving very difficult. Freya started to come home earlier and look down. She became a little more attentive, but still didn't want to make love with me. She later told me that she had to go on a trip to America, and she was quite excited about it. I think she planned to spend a week of work and ducking with this guy. I wanted to confront her in a big way when she got back, and when she left, I downloaded some movie editing software and created what I could only describe as a corno of her and her lover. I watched the footage, anger burned inside me. Freya dragged the guy forcefully into the house and pulled him down for a hungry kiss, before taking him by the hand and taking him into her bedroom. She couldn't get his trousers and underwear down quickly enough. Taking his clock into her mouth. "Duck, Freya. You're incredible at that," he said in his clear American accent. His compliment made her bob her head harder. Freya loved me eating her kitty, but she was always reticent about going down on me, so I was getting even angrier. Her American lover pulled himself out of her mouth and then pushed her up the bed. Freya had a sultry smirk on her face as her legs parted. She lifted her hips and her dress was pushed up and her panties were removed. The American then plunged his face into her kitty. Freya moaned and her back arched as he set to work. "Duck, duck," she moaned. "Don't stop, Kyle, duck." I could tell she came hard. Kyle, so that was his name. I was kind of happy to find out his name. I don't know why. I just was. I suppose it made him more human. I then paused the footage. It was then my heart broke. Freya pulled his head up and I saw it. Her eyes sparkled as she smiled at him. the smile she used to only have for me. As I stared at Freya smiling at Kyle, her eyes sparkling, tears flowing down my face, I got a message from Freya. I love you, I miss you. It came with kissing and heart emojis. To be honest, it threw me a curveball. I suppose that is a great phrase to use considering Kyle was American. I decided to call my editing a night. I then got a call from Freya at midnight. She talked to me earnestly with lots of I love you, and I miss you so much. My emotions were all over the place. I completed my editing throughout the week, sleeping in the spare room as I couldn't bear to sleep in mine, and was ready to show Freya the footage when she returned. All the while she told me how much she loved me every time she called me. Something struck me when I watched her and Kyle ducking. Freya kept talking about leaving me and transferring to America. Kyle sounded very non-committal, but Freya didn't seem to notice. Oh shit. He's married. I exclaimed out loud. That explained why she was telling me she loved and missed me. She went to America and found out he was married. When Freya returned on Saturday, she suddenly became the old Freya again. We made love every day, not even jet lag stopped her. I'm so sorry for being cold for the past year. I love you. I want to start a family with you, she told me with great certainty. Doubt crept into my mind. That was until she was sent homesick from work. She stayed homesick for the rest of the week. I accepted her excuse that it was fatigue from all the traveling. When you love somebody, really love somebody, you can believe the lies. That was until I saw her being sick one morning and the guilty face she hid from me as I came to check on her. My blood ran cold. Let's stay in tonight and watch a film. You need to rest, I told her gently. She smiled weakly at me and agreed. That evening, I poured us some wine and got the popcorn ready for us. She snuggled up to me when I sat down next to her. What are we watching? She asked excitedly. It is a surprise, I told her. I pressed play and footage of Freya ducking Kyle appeared on our television. I felt Freya stiffen next to me. Switch it off, she whispered when she called Kyle baby on the television. Switch it off, she said louder and more panicked. When I didn't, she completely lost it. She stood up and threw her wine glass at the television, sending wine and glass everywhere, and turned to me wild and wide-eyed. Switch it off. Switch it off. Switched it off, she screamed over and over again. At the sight of Freya losing control, I did as she wanted. It was now time to talk. Why, Freya? Why did you do it? Because you have no ducking ambition in life, she told me. At least You mean, Kyle, I interrupted her. Guilt swept over her when I mentioned his name, making her infidelity real. I'm sorry, Charlie. I screwed up. I got carried away, but I'm ready to settle down and spend the rest of my life with you. Freya was openly crying now. Her cheating and lies were now coming home to roost. Ducking hell. Screwed up doesn't even come close, I shouted at her. I love you, Charlie, she pleaded desperately. Love me? You wanted to leave me for Kyle. Was it when you found out he was married that you decided to come back to me? How did you know? It was obvious watching you two talk. He never committed to anything and you were too stupid to notice. Charlie, please. I do love you, Freya insisted. You're pregnant, aren't you? I said flatly. She stared at me in horror. The crushing reality then hit me. Oh my God. You knew you were pregnant before you went to America, and when you found out he was married, you decided to make love to me to convince me that Kyle's baby was mine. Freya fell down at my feet, gripping my hand tightly, sobbing loudly. The baby is yours. It is yours. It has to be yours. On hearing the last part, I angrily pulled my hand away. We're done, Freya. I want a divorce. I'll do a paternity test when the baby is born, but I doubt it is necessary. We both know it isn't mine, I told her cruelly. I'm so sorry. Freya pathetically sobbed. What have you done, Freya? You got pregnant with a married man's baby, and you are going to be a single mom. Freya just stayed on the floor sobbing, unable to look at me. Was being with me so bad? Was I boring? I did have ambition, just not how you wanted. I'm sorry, Charlie, she said between sobs. I got carried away with the excitement of my career. How ambitious Kyle was. I couldn't understand why you weren't career-driven like me. When I found out that Kyle was married and he was an asshole and I was pregnant with his baby, I realized too late what I had done. When I talked to him about leaving you, it was after I found out I was pregnant. I was going to surprise him when we went to New York, but he was met at the airport by his wife and children. I felt my whole life crashing down around me, right there and then. You were my only hope. I wanted to give this baby a father, and I knew you would have been a perfect father. I should be carrying your baby. We should be having a family together, a happy family, and now I have ruined everything. Pangs of sympathy came over me. She was now being honest. I felt more sympathy for the baby, who would be a permanent reminder to Freya of her infidelity, and being told that its asshole biological father, who lived half a world away, wanted nothing to do with it. It was beyond messed up. You can stay here tonight, but I'll call your parents now, and they can pick you up tomorrow. I don't think you should drive anywhere. 6 months later, a heavily pregnant Freya agreed to all my demands in the divorce. She cried throughout it all. I took less than I could have because she needed to provide for the baby. That baby was the true innocent party. I took no pleasure being free from her. The court insisted on a paternity test, but when the baby was born the result was never in doubt. Once the paternity test was confirmed and no child support was required, our divorce was finalized. Freya's parents were embarrassed and ashamed of their daughter and wished me the best, encouraging me to move on. Freya told Kyle about the baby, and being the asshole he was, he refused to accept it was his. I don't know if Freya will go to court in America and try to get him to accept his responsibility, but to be honest, it isn't my problem. I genuinely wish Freya and the baby all the best, and that they find a happy ever after. Her infidelity destroyed her marriage, lost her friends, ruined her career, and she is a single mom with a child the father doesn't want to acknowledge. That level of mistake will scar and haunt her for the rest of her life. I hope she meets someone else who will adopt that child and becomes his father. That child deserves that much. For me, it was back to square one. I was made redundant. They were really embarrassed about it when I told him about me and Freya. They probably thought they were kicking me when I was down. I used the redundancy money and the money from the sale of the house to start a business selling my CCTV system that I built to catch Freya. The business quickly grew and I sold it and the patent, making a fortune. I gave some to Freya, who gratefully accepted it, but it also made her regret telling me I had no ambition. She was having a hard time financially, so taking the stress of money away helped her enormously. I know I didn't have to, but I still loved her even if I couldn't forgive her. She emailed me now and again to apologize for everything. I met with her one last time at her parents' house to tell her to move on for her own happiness. I never could bring myself to hate her, but if I had, it would have gone that day. It was heartbreaking to see her that way. The girl was very cute and looked like Freya. She should have been yours, she told me, and she asked if there was any chance for us again, and begged for me to be the baby's father. It was a desperate thing to ask, so full of regret and low self-esteem. The girl may have looked like Freya, but parts of her looked like someone else who wasn't me. I'm sorry, Freya. I've moved on, I replied. I held her as she sobbed until her mother came into the room to let me leave. I then took off on a world tour to clear my head, where I met my second wife. I got her pregnant before we married, and that was my traveling life done until I retire, but I am content with that. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next exciting story. See you in the next video.